Welcome to the State of the Nation. With us today, I'm very happy to say, Dr. Ongama Mtimka. He is a lecturer in the Department of History and Political Studies at the Nelson Mandela University. He's got extensive experience in industrial development, local government, community and small business development, and higher education. Ongama, welcome to the State of the Nation.
Thank you, Mike. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Yeah, you see, you're trying to kill me with kindness. Let's first start off with what I've said over there, with what you're doing at Nelson Mandela University.
Awesome.
If you do all of these studies, if you're lecturing people in all of these things, why are you so bad at your job? Because it seems to me that almost everything that you do there, we do so badly in South Africa. What is going wrong? We do badly in industrial development. Our local government's a mess. Communities are on fire. Small business development, that is at a punchline because that's almost a joke. And higher education, we've got the pensioner running it.
Sure. So let me start with the easier one, the politics. Political science departments in the country under apartheid needed to say we were not preparing people to go into politics. That was a tactical move because for need to survive. We would say we are training people for a wide range of, activities that they can do once they leave university. About 3-4 years ago, precisely because of what you say, that the politics is bad, right? I said, but why have we as a discipline actually kept on saying this, that we were not preparing politicians? So I became intentional about saying, I, in fact, am preparing people who are going to go into politics. So my first year module on South African politics, trends in contemporary South African politics, I became a lot more intentional about educating students about what are the pathways to getting into politics. The DA and the EFF have had very seamless transition from student politics to mainstream party politics. So that created a really good opportunity. I see the ANC is also trying to catch up with that. We are trying to get it right. And the more of our graduates who have the attributes that we want, that we desire as a country, go into politics, the better it's going to be. But, Mike, business has a role. In fact, the multiplicity of social actors have a role in what kind of leadership we have.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from you is that we don't have a political problem anywhere but in the ANC. Because everybody else, as you said, is kind of doing it seamlessly.
So as far as accepting new talent, the DA is the best. The evidence is there. We've got DASO transitioning to, the party transitioning to parliament. That's evident. Followed by the EFF. The EFF, because of its youthfulness, it doesn't have rules like you have to be 10 years in the party before you can assume a leadership position. As such, the process has been relatively seamless as well. However, we do need, in fact, what has collapsed the ANC has been a crisis of values, where the values of service, the values of being committed to a bigger ideal than a particular group of patronage politicians, collapsed. They were there before. I started working in Kucha in 2006, and we used to deal with government, local government. Things were working under the ANC government.
I think you're being generous, because already then we were beset with scandals. Let's not forget that the arms deal happened in the 90s.
Absolutely, but the commitment to building a narrative of black people can govern in government was there. Let me make an example. Kucha, for example, when Alan Young, the chief CFO, came in, made the point, wow, guys, I've never seen an organization with such a highly educated workforce, majority black, and very committed to excellence. I left there to go work for the municipality. Again, brilliant executives. In fact, about 3 of them went to work for the city of Cape Town. They were saying back then, because where the crisis started in the ANC, as far as I'm concerned, was in the Polokwane aftermath, where the purgings were happening. So, for example, PE was the best municipality since the mid-1990s. The reason being, the municipality was ran by a group of politicians that came more from the UDF strand, which was mainly professionals, both white and black, who had something to do outside of politics, and could, if the politics wasn't working, they were going to exit, go be a lawyer, whatever the case may be. And in fact, that was the case. Now, in 2009 in Nelson Mandela Bay, after the Stalini group came from Polokwane, buoyed by the fact that they had Zuma they deliberately went after the then municipal manager, Graham Richards, as well as a very progressive municipal manager, by the way, the then Mayor Nondumiso Mapazi. And then after that, there was since 2009, there hasn't been a mayor who finished a term. There hasn't been a city manager who finished a term. And as I was doing research recently on the economic development strategy for the city, I was appalled to see how joint infrastructure coordinating mechanisms that were there in the mid-2000s, excellent. Joint destination marketing. Also, Nelson Mandela Bay back in the day, all disaster management services were proven to respond within 15 minutes. So if there's a trigger, either from the police or from other emergency services, it was guaranteed 15-minute response. And all of those things are now over. The reason being a debilitating political environment, which has made those who had talent, that were both black and white, who were in the municipality, to leave to go and work elsewhere, some of them in the city of Cape Town. And this is where we are. So the point I was making is that there was a deliberate intention to build. Even as scandals were there, scandals will be there. I mean, governments have scandals everywhere. We're concerned in the US, for example, about the deep state, the vote buying mechanic. This is the template of democracy across the world. So where we need to correct things is to bring back that values-driven leadership and accountability.
Well, accountability begins, one would say, begins and ends with the voters, isn't it? And in the Eastern Cape, repeatedly the ANC gets one of its bigger majorities in the Eastern Cape. I mean, they're under no threat. They could go and burn the place down, as they practically did in the last 10 years, and still expect to get returned to power.
Sure, they are under threat. So you see, the ANC voter, especially in the Eastern Cape, is a calculating voter, is a very rational voter. So if you...
How does that align with your earlier story about the destruction of the city? They're calculating.
I'll let you know. So I grew up in Port Elizabeth and then in some rural areas in Paddy.
We can call it Kabeja, even.
Kabeja. I grew up in Kabeja. So I spent the first 8 years of my life there. So municipal services were not provided in full before 94. So you had running water, toilets outside, electricity was limited. Then you had lots of informal settlements. In the rural areas, at home, if you were going to my village, you would see by the generator that was lit. So it was a sort of a lighthouse of the entire group of villages, because we had a generator at home. In the 90s, though, there was a rollout of electricity in the rural areas. By the way, we thought that was because we had a small shop at home. When my uncle changed our gas fridges to electricity, we thought that was like a really great thing to happen. Today, obviously, we regret that because you have load shedding. Then in the townships, huge investments in integrated human settlements were made. Nelson Mandela Bay became the best municipality in the late 2000s to deliver housing. And in fact, what the DA is asking the ANC to do, for example, with policing, to say devolve some of this, it's being done in the housing space, where once a municipality has proved its competencies as a housing delivery agent, it gets direct allocations from national government. So the Nelson Mandela Bay. Now, all of those things happened between the late 90s and the mid-2010s. The mid-2010s, it was still continuing. They're trying to revive it now. So all of those things didn't serve to discourage the voter, okay, who is a rationally calculating individual as far as what has been my cost and benefits, if we are to use a utilitarian perspective on voting behavior. However, to your point, as things started collapsing, guess where did the voter had foresight in Nelson Mandela Bay. Because even before things collapsed in 2009, already the ANC was sitting at it edged the 2011 elections by around 50%. So it became clear. And at that time, that's when things were still working, by the way. And I think what we would explain it in political sciences as there was success in getting people some basic services, then what happens is that the expectations become higher. And indeed, in that period, voter behavior started shifting away from the ANC. However, what opposition parties often blame the voter for, when it's in fact is a strategic issue of how they approach the electorate, is failing to vote for them, when in fact they have no compelling reasons why they should. The ANC, for example, passed an 80-20 budget, capital budget principle that said 80% must go to previously disadvantaged wards. And this was not just politicking. It included basic things like tarring of gravel roads, providing water within a 200-meter radius in informal settlements, and other things, right? So a voter who has got that in the current government is going to be shifting because they are not happy about corruption, but not to the extent that they think they have a total loss. You know what I mean? They're weighing cost and benefit. So that's what's happened. Well, that's why in 2016, we see a huge turn in ANC strongholds from a voting behavior point of view. In fact, that's been a voter base that has showed fluidity. The DA often claims that it's actually pulled support from the ANC. The EFF has pulled support from the ANC. The DA only in the latter year of the 2010s did it start losing support to the Freedom Front Plus. Otherwise, it had been consolidating support since 2009. 2004 became the representative of minority interests, and minority meaning Indian, white, colored at the time. And then started growing that until 2019. So the point I'm making is that to your question about whether voters are responsive to there's been things collapsing, absolutely they have. The rural base relates with government in a very little way. We have no roads that are maintained by the state. I mean, there's some roads, but it's water. We still have traditional methods of harvesting water. So the behavior of the state in rural areas is not such that there's a very direct link between regime performance and voter experience, to an extent that the rate at which electoral support would change would mirror the urban areas. If you look at the big cities, Queenstown, Mthatha, East London, and Gqeberha, you see that despite the story of a dominant ANC, when you start looking narrowly in those cities, it's like, wow, voters in Mthatha are actually not giving the ANC a majority above 60%.
Okay, so
significantly above 60%.
So if the game South Africa's turning into, the rural-urban divide is real.
Sure.
It's growing. It's a facet that everybody seems to get except for the ANC. has the ANC inadvertently not done themselves quite a favor in the urban areas? And I was, just some recent news. We've had this terrible situation with the taxi violence and striking down in Cape Town. Tshwane has been riding a roller coaster of hell for the recent time. Johannesburg's an absolute mess. It seems like one thing that the ANC might have done that's going to serve them politically is they managed to destroy these cities so badly that when the opposition takes over, they can't look good. It's almost impossible for them to look good.
So there are two factors. One, the ability of municipalities to respond to internal audit findings, and the ability of municipalities related to that to respond to Auditor General findings, and then the ability to recruit the right people for the job. So those were the key issues. Now, when it comes to the internal audit issues, the issue is simple there. Internal audit finds, and this is, by the way, Mike, I didn't realize how great this is for South Africa until I was working in South Sudan doing some consulting work around federalism, where you realize that there isn't as much as a system of national accounts that is credible and an audit practice that is credible. So here, whatever happens, we know where money goes.
Yes.
We know, we are able to trace it, and when it gets stolen, we know exactly where it gets stolen because of the accounting. We have one of the best accounting professions in the world in South Africa. It's been under severe pressure, both private sector being responsible for that and in cahoots with politicians. But where there was a failure in the ANC was in this thing of not wanting to hold the administration or unscrupulous politicians accountable in line with audit findings or forensic investigation findings. They had this thing of having an overbearing region or province, which is going to protect politicians because they are allied to their faction. What excites me about all the failures that President Cyril Ramaphosa has had, and there are many, is to see commitment to leadership capability and ethics, which is now different. So, for example, it started with prescribing councillors. Then it started prescribing mayoral candidates, what kind of candidates they should be. It failed to ensure that provinces and national had a similar approach in terms of leadership selection. But that thing which Kgalema Motlanthe introduced of, some integrity mechanism, those are helping in party building, which is saying to you and I, at least the culture of having an overbearing effect on the administration there has been corrected. Remember, the ANC is going to lose power nationally on average, but it's still going to be a significant part in South African political economic life. So that's one. With respect to recruitment, I'm happy about the work that's being done by the public service mission and the fact that we've got coalitions. Because now, when you have coalitions, you're going to fight about appointments of senior executives. When under a one party, you can't.
Yes.
And so we just have to build. Yes, there's been distraction. And the one story, by the way, that we haven't looked at is the role of senior government officials in the bureaucracy in that collapse. As I look at this, I'm like, wow. I called, for example, one of the executives that used to be at Nelson Mandela to say, I'm looking at this, that used to be there, it's no longer there. Where are you, by the way, these days? I'm in City of Cape Town. CFO, that used to be top performing CFO. Nelson Mandela Bay, if in a given year it collected 97%, that was a failure. Because on average, collection rates in Nelson Mandela Bay were 98, 99%. And so now you need to ensure that not just politicians only, but also the administration, people must do their jobs. I mean, how can we be comfortable in the country, acknowledging politicians only when you have executives who should have had agency to mobilize for budgets, to mobilize for allocation of resources, to recruit the right people. It's not, politicians may be pressuring senior executives to recruit so and so, but the law is very clear that you must recruit the right people for the job. Now there's been mediocrity at a leadership perspective, both in the administration and at the political level, and in the private sector. We talk less about how collapse has been in values in the private sector in South Africa, where we actually need to say, how do we build together? How do we build this sense of commitment to the country and start, for example, this is part of it, where we're talking about them, but also we're following through in terms of where things are not working and can be improved.
Yes. Now we're going to get back onto coalitions, which we've been quite involved in, with having many of the opposition parties that are forming part of those coalition talks about the pre-election coalition pact. Which may not be named on this channel because I hate that name so much. But let's talk about the private sector, because you raised the specter of the private sector.
Sure.
Now, I fully agree with you that there must be some massive accountability in the private sector. The biggest problem, as I see it, is we've got a government who seemingly does not understand business and is openly hostile to any small and medium-sized business. Big South African business, as was mentioned at our big live event where we featured most of the leaders of the opposition parties. In South Africa, our big business leaders in South Africa have never met a government they didn't like. They were happy to work with the National Party when they were doing their worst.
Sure.
Now they go and rescue the ANC by trying to help them, suddenly, 1 year before the election, big companies are working hand in hand with the government to try and fix up what the government has destroyed. It's almost crazy when, to me, the logical thing to do is to take a bit of short-term pain. Let's get rid of the ANC government because they are the problem, right? It's as clear. That's exactly what those CEOs would say at the Braai, but yet they go and step in because their businesses thrive on over-regulation, tariffs, barriers, and boy, I've run small businesses my whole life. It's impossible to do business in South Africa against the big companies because they have the protection of government. They're in collusion.
Yeah, wow, that line, that last line is interesting. So the business takes action and factors in viability. Right. So the political viability of an alternative to the ANC, judged from the perspective of voter behavior, is not a rosy picture. By the way, I do not subscribe to President Mbeki's view that the ANC cannot afford to fail because the country fails. I don't subscribe to that. But I also factor in from a rational perspective that there is no political future in the immediate term between 24, 26 and 2029 where you can be able to have a zero-sum game with respect to the ANC. So the game is non-zero-sum. One thing we need to do in South Africa is to separate between partisan interests and national interest. Business, you're quite right, by the way, at the core of the relationship between our economy and politics has been a mutually beneficial relationship between big business and politics for the longest history.
Not right. Only for the last 85 years. But that's cozy.
No.
Boy, it's ridiculously cozy.
Look at, for example, you see at the foundation of our economy, you needed a mass supply of black, cheap, vulnerable labor. Okay. The administrator of the remaking of the majority of the population to become that was the state. Like forced expropriations of properties, imposition of taxes through, you had to pay cash instead of cattle. Now, all of those were mechanisms to remake the majority of the population to not have an independent economy, but rather to become a mass supply of labor for the mining sector initially. Yes. And then from that, big agriculture, big industry. You know, all of that. So it's been right. There could not have been a development of a version of capitalism in South Africa without a very strong hand by the state. Now look at this in the late 60s, early 70s, commodities crisis, and the racial capitalism no longer works, right? The business starts pressuring the National Party. You got to allow black trade unions. Why? Because they were being game theoretic. They realized the white labor unions had become so powerful and had a monopoly. So business wanted to have black labor unions to also be allowed to play a role. That happened. Also, it is business that says to the National Party government, drop the Calabar legislation about who can get what skilled jobs. Because by that time in the late 60s, mainly white people had becoming upper middle class, and there was a huge need. In fact, that's where structural unemployment becomes apparent, because now you need an economy with a lot more skilled workforce. Government has been preventing black people from acquiring those jobs. So business says to government, drop the rules. We actually need to have a significant cohort of black people who are now skilled. Yes. And then the last point I want to make about this mutual relationship between business and during apartheid, Sam Peter Blanche, God bless his soul, makes this point that it was a search for a new version of accumulation in South Africa that makes South African business, starting from Anglo big mining to big finance, to be intentional about engaging the ANC in exile and say to government, we actually need to move on. And Sampi makes the point that business made the calculation that if they were not party to a process of triggering the events that would collapse apartheid, South Africa's version of capitalism, whatever it's called, would collapse with apartheid. So they then were able to foster this transition that results in the collapse of apartheid without upsetting the structure of the economy. We've arrived at a stage now, so that I would call that the order of 94. We have arrived at a stage now where that even doesn't work. You know, because, if you look at big businesses profited from democracy significantly, yes. Right? And the reason why they're able to sit on huge reserves of cash is precisely because democracy has been good for them. And that means the game theoretic, strategic maneuvers they made in the late 70s have paid off. Now we're saying, now we need an order of 24 that is different from 94, wherein it's not about how best you can calculate to leverage the political chaos so that business continues to thrive. It's about how do we structure an arrangement where the economy works. Because, Mike, as you say, you're saying small business is battling to thrive. Part of it is a political story, but part of it is a big concentration story in South Africa, where there's this vertical integration of the economy. Everybody owns this, and from logistics companies, you'll find that big companies that are busy doing some things are also involved in logistics, which precludes the absorption of small players. If you go to construction, we have a big five. You go to banking, we have a big five. You go to agriculture, so these big structures are in fact preventing the thriving of big business. We go to the media space, the same. Everywhere you go, the structure of our economy is not creating a permissive environment. And you're quite right that this big structure has a symbiotic relationship with the politics. And that's why, by the way, it was easy for them to undertake transformation through a strategy of co-option, rather than saying, let's create meaningful opportunities for small players in ways that, and by the way, talking BE quickly,
Yes.
there are a lot of, say there was a white engineer that was working in a company, and this engineer could go and start, say it's a component manufacturing company. BE says, we want you to be intentional about involving a business person who is black. Guess what do people who have connections do? They go take a politician and not a business person. And then they cry about BE when in fact they are partnering with politicians and expecting them to become business people. Anyway, that's another story. But
It's not another story, it's the only story. It is the story of failure in South Africa.
yeah, so but you find that there are black entrepreneurs who are working in communities despite a hugely unenabling environment. But if their counterparts who've got access, because remember there's social capital, chances that an average black person knows somebody in the private sector who's got, well, that has changed as a result of employment equity, but not in significant ways if the reports are anything to go by. So more often than not, a white entrepreneur is going to have more connections in the private sector than their black counterpart on average, right? There will be outliers. Now, imagine if they were partnering with people who are good technical people but don't know how to access the markets, the mainstream markets. And those partnerships don't have to be handouts. These hard-working black people that are working in townships and stuff, including their small, as business white counterparts, are just working hard. People who are working hard. Now, if you connected them, you would be enhancing economic value, but together they are fighting big business that's concentrated. A quick story, for example. I've got a friend of mine, him and I mentioned small business support services. Him and I were consulting to development finance agencies and small business agencies, right, to their clients so that we can help their clients to write business plans, feasibility studies so they can access funding. He then took that skill, went back home, mobilized huge plowing fields, partnered with big business, agriculture, decoperasi in the Eastern Cape. I kid you not, my friend wouldn't have a problem with me saying this. They've leveraged over 300 million. It's benefiting 5,000 individuals back in his villages. And all that it took was a person who is clued up a little bit, partnering with a big company, mostly white-owned, but they are intentional about partnering, because that intentionality creates for them access to huge plowing fields, which is not a farm, which is not expensive. And as a result of that, created a pathway to inclusion. By the way, that's a book I'm currently writing, Pathways to Inclusion, a Political Economy of South Africa in the 21st Century, where I'm saying there's economic inefficiency with non-inclusion. Whether you are looking at the inclusion of small white business owners in big business value chains, or you're looking at the exclusion of hard-working black women and men in value chains that are meaningful. So our story is a story of a mess that we all need to work together to resolve.
Yeah, but there's a few issues with your story. Obviously, this friend of yours who managed such a wonderful initiative eventually has to go to a big business purely because he couldn't do it with a small or medium-sized business,
sure,
regardless of the complexion of the business owner.
Sure.
Right? It's our go-to position. We go to big companies to try and get that funding or that partnership or whatever.
Yeah.
That is why, in my experience, big companies never complain about BEE because they've got it covered. If I wanted to offer you a job in this company, which I would gladly do, I'm going to have to compete with somebody else that's going to offer you a big sign-on fee, equity, a big salary, instead of you taking a chance, right? So in other words, he loves BE because he's getting Mtimka at a ridiculous price. Overvalued, doesn't matter what the price is, that I can't compete in.
Except that if Mtimka is a filmmaker,
Yes,
who's operating in a market where he doesn't have the network that Sham has, the relationship is not a relationship of one is taking from the other or one is bearing a cost more than the other. It's a relationship of mutual value creation and mutual enhancement of business and expansion. Yes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there is no need to recruit ready-made, thriving people. There's need to recruit filmmakers who are working hard, have secured this business here and there, and by them coming, they're augmenting the capacity of the business and are creating access to a new market of new novel stories.
Yes.
For example, I've got this partner of mine who works in Helenvale. A big Helenvale in Gqeberha is what Mitchell's Plain is to Cape Town, right? So this guy has been able to produce broadcast quality documentaries for the national broadcasters. All that he needs is not some handout of sorts. He needs more access to opportunities to create lovely media production.
Yes.
And in his space, despite how successful he may be, there are spaces where he'll never have as much as an opportunity to code on someone. So we have to look at BE not from the 1990s version where you're getting someone because you want to comply. It doesn't make business. It doesn't make business sense.
Are you saying that we still need BE?
Absolutely. Absolutely, Mike. And by the way, Mike, and a friend in the U.S. was saying to me, this is what Martin Luther King was saying to white establishment in the U.S., that without me, who's pro-moderated approaches to integration, you then have Malcolm X. This is what he was saying. Indeed, in South Africa, it's a reality that black entrepreneurship was precluded everywhere, even in the homelands, right? It's Roger Southall who writes a story of how from way back, there was just, Herman Mashaba is really a miracle in terms of his ability to actually survive under that environment and be able to produce a thriving business. So let's look at something as simple as the ability to either inherit property that you can leverage, or to have bought property in the 70s, which you can leverage in the 80s or early 90s. Black people couldn't own property in that is titled.
Yes.
Until the 80s, right? Which means the first generation to settle property bonds and all of those things could have been in the early 2000s. And those would be your teachers, your nurses, these professionals that could start buying property in the 80s, right? So that means there's a very small fraction of people who can access to small business finance, leveraging assets. RDP program has been good in the sense that all of a sudden people have got assets worth 130,000 minimum. And they can now start playing. But the point I'm making is that there's so much that precludes talent. And in my firm yes on BEE, I'm saying as to the extent that it makes business sense. And if we stop looking at it from a compliance perspective, there's huge opportunities for it to make business sense. There's a lot of talent that is now 3 decades into democracy, good black talent that in a racial capitalist structure like South Africa still need those relationships with their white counterparts in ways that say, how do I leverage your network? Mike, the chance that I'm going to meet a black person with your years of experience in industry, whatever the industries are relatively smaller, right? And by the way, you with age, there's wisdom, there's experience, there's everything else. As a person in my 40s now, I just entered the 40s 2 days ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Downhill from here.
So I've also got, 17 years experience. The leverage that comes from either me partnering with another person who's just starting out or whatever the case may be. There's apartheid killed a development of a leveraging of relationships in ways that are really great for South Africa. And I'm saying we must tear down those. And it doesn't happen without intentionality. It doesn't happen without the laws. Sadly, I mean, with my son, my son relates from a deep social relationship with his white counterparts. For his generation, we might start saying, it does, because remember, business flows from friendship sometimes.
Sure.
Opportunities from which is what sociologists call social capital. Maybe in his generation we'll start saying, drop this, drop that, because the relationships have been allowed to develop across racial lines in ways that are mutually beneficial.
Well, my view on this, and I've been quite outspoken on this, is that I see legislated social what's the word, engineering, right, never ends well. Ask apartheid. I see it having two effects. One is that I would imagine that what you're going to see is what we're seeing already, is this massive polarization of business. Few really massive big companies that can do every deal under the sun because they are not challenged. The law stops them from being competed against, right? That happens. They're able to play the game much better. So you end up with these massive businesses getting bigger, and you end up with everybody else doing almost subsistence, almost lifestyle businesses that can't challenge those guys. And the guys getting squeezed out in the middle are what we would call SMEs, depending on everybody's interpretation what an SME is. I'm talking here about a formal medium-sized business. One that pays taxes, one that rents office space, a shop, whatever it is. It's a formal business. It's not something I run out of my garage. Okay, that will be absolutely and is already on its last legs, and it's going to be killed off completely if we keep on going with this social engineering. And then the second point that I have is that in my experience, I have a lot more confidence in the ability of black South Africans than it seems like most politicians have. I see them as being unbelievably entrepreneurial, unbelievably creative, talented, etc., and being held back by this understanding that you need the social engineering to help you. And I'm using, as an example, I'm using the Afrikaner in South Africa, whose go-to position until the late 80s was to work for the state. Unshackled with that burden, look at all the Afrikaner business. Now we talk about the Stellenbosch Mafia, right?
I like that, yeah.
30 years ago, you'd be talking about the Parktown Mafia or the Sandton Mafia. No, Stellenbosch, that was a backwater. Why are these places so prosperous? So prosperous because the Afrikaner was unshackled of the social engineering that everybody said they were benefiting from.
Love it.
I'm a hater of social engineering.
Sure.
So I've never seen it work. Yes.
Sure. Two things. Let me start with the easier one. So BE policy has been responsive to that, Mike. So, for example, the qualifying small enterprise mechanism is an attempt to say you cannot measure small businesses, even if white-owned, the same way that you measure big business. So legislation since the 2003 Act and then the revisions are accommodating those things.
But while there's any act,
Sure, I'll talk to it.
The implementation is different, right?
That's a philosophical debate,
Once again, I can refer back, and you mentioned my experience and wisdom, right?
Yeah.
In other words, I'm old.
Yeah.
I understand the confusion back in the apartheid days where you never really knew where this thing started or ended. So everybody applied their own sort of vicious version of it.
I'll explain. So let me get to that now. So the first one I wanted to say was directly in relation to BEE. It's been responsive to the legislation. Now you've obviously got it's been responsive to the cries. BEE has moved from the 90s. In the 90s it was these big deals, right? And in fact, both the players, because the collapse in 98, the 2009, eroded the value. I think it's Vuyo who actually chronicles the story of how BEE has actually matured from potential access to quickback to being, there's no business you can do without hard work. Okay, so let me leave that. So in my response to you, I was saying, the legislation has been responsive to small players by saying these are the ways in which you can avoid not to comply with these elements, but these are the elements that we need to comply with. Then lastly, we come to Afrikaner. So Sampi for me, that was a gift. As a spiritual person, I would say he was a gift from God even. Because Sampi writes this book, A History of Inequality in South Africa, 1652 to 2002. And he makes the point you are making, that the English, in the initial phase of state and capitalist formation in South Africa, controlled the state and the private sector. And as a result of that, were able to build through the state a particular class of people. And in fact, by the way, if you look at it in black social mobility circles, it was the Amamfengu, the first to receive Christianity, closely associated with mission schools, receive mission education, who were also taking along in terms of the development of a class of people which intimidated Verwoerd, and I'll talk about that. Now, Isampi makes the point that in 48, you then have so what you're saying happened to the Afrikaner in the 80s happened to the English from the 40s. And Sampi makes the point that at that time in the 40s, the English had been able to leverage the state enough to be able to survive a pressure that pulls them out of the state, because they have enough capital, they had enough money to be able to start venturing into the private sector. Now, in that period from the 40s, especially to the 60s, the so-called golden age of apartheid, okay, maybe from the 50s to the 60s, I'm going to be in trouble for saying golden age. That golden age was led by huge import substituting industrialization by the apartheid state because it was fearing sanctions. And so prescribed localization of content, which I don't understand how the DA is able to fight against localization prescriptions in the renewable energy space. This is how economies grow. So they prescribe import substituting industrialization. Guess who were the mostly predispositioned to actually leverage that? Were the English. Sure. Okay, because they had built enough capital while they had the state. And indeed, you're quite right. Somebody makes the point that by the time the black majority has access to the state, the Afrikaner were successful, and that's a story we don't tell much. You're quite right in how the Afrikaner mobilized state power to create a cohort of thriving Afrikaners. In the ESCOMs, all these state-owned enterprises, right? All of them were leveraged for social engineering. And then in the 90s, so Sampi writes in 2002, obviously, I mean, he didn't have much democratic South African life to observe in terms of what the consequences of the ANC's, but he makes the point that the ANC, one, is failing to use the state power in the same way that it had been used by the English and the Afrikaner, to create a critical mass of people who were going to be able to very soon be able to survive on their own in the private sector. Okay, now looking at it many years later in this book, and by the way, this book that I'm writing, I'm saying it's a successor to Sampi's A History of Inequality, because what I want to do is to engage this debate, because I think it's a fair debate. It's a fair question that says, in what ways can we do inclusion without too much emphasis on race? But I'm also saying, let us not be too quick to want to do our way. The obstacle is the way. To deal with race in a moderated, in a humane way, where we're saying some racial policies we're going to need to have if we want to avoid, you know how white economic empowerment happened initially was through massive land grabs, massive. Lot of bloodshed, a lot of so that's the history of the making of sorry for you to use a settler economy, right? And it needed a marginalization of the indigenous economies that existed. So in the diaries, for example, of the early settlers, one of the missionaries, I think, reads a diary of a lady who was saying, it's so hard to find labor here. And then, I think it's Nkaitobi who actually claims this. And then after both the wars of dispossession and then the Nongqawuse episode, where Amaxhosa, for example, destroyed cattle and all of that, and he says, all of a sudden, labor supply in the famine, both in the interwar and the famine period that followed Nongqawuse, all of a sudden, so mass impoverization has to be corrected by some mechanism of redress. And some mechanism of redress is better and should be hard fought for by both white and black South Africans because it closes the space for agitations for extremist positions.
Ongama, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. We've run out of time. It's been brilliant. You're writing that book. We're going to get you on your next trip to Johannesburg as soon as that book is done. Thank you so much for joining us today on the State of the Nation. I hope you had a good time. It's been wonderful talking to you.
I had a wonderful time, Mike, and we should have this conversation. They're difficult.
They're very
There's a saying in Xhosa that says, "Siphola ngokuthunukwa," that is, a wound heals when it's pricked.
Yeah.
So the more we allow ourselves spaces to talk about how do some feel alienated by what we're trying to do? How do some feel, we're going to find the solutions that work.
We will do. Ongama, thank you so much for making time to be with us today. To everybody that watched us on the State of the Nation, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. If you've watched this far, subscribe to the channel. We'll see you pretty soon on the State of the Nation. Thank you very much.